Machiavellian Dogmatics. As many of you know, I'm somewhat interested in theology and thinking about God. Unlike some who would claim that academic theology is inherently detached from daily life and the core of the living gospel, I would maintain that theology, as it ought to be, is deeply intertwined with all authentic Christian living. Thinking hard about God cannot be bypassed even if one does not use complicated academic words. In particular, my main interest is within the subtopic of theological method, that is, how it is that we do theology. When I tell people that, I often get responses that either show that the person has no idea what I'm talking about, or a comment to the effect that theological method is not all that important, for one reason or another. Most people I know are more concerned with what we believe than how it is we come to believe it. This concern is evident in the fact that we tend to let particular theological conclusions dominate our discussion. Oftentimes we will find that it's not totally clear when looking directly at an issue which side is right and which is wrong. In fact, oftentimes I find that both sides of a debate are wrong if for no other reason than because the question they're hoping to answer is wrongfully formed. That it is a question that arises from a source outside of the gospel. In such cases, it is primarily a methodological investigation that will reveal this to be the case and will help to redirect attention to more appropriate and central issues. It seems to me that the Church might have fallen victim to a kind of Machiavellian dogmatics. That is, a whole way of doing theology where, whether we realize it or not, is characterized by an attitude that believes that the ends justify the means. It is of little consequence how we get to a particular belief, only that we finally hold it. This Machiavellian dogmatics takes more than one form. For particularly conservative people, it tends to take the form of measuring orthodoxy by issuing some variety of doctrinal examination, such as a fairly rigid acceptance of a fairly narrow doctrinal statement. In such a case, it's not so important if a person understands the connections between the doctrines, or even believes that they're related to one another at all, aside from being doctrines taught in the Bible, but simply that they will confess that they believe them. A particularly liberal form of this attitude is, it doesn't matter what you believe so long as you love people, or so long as you don't hurt anyone else. This respects the desire to foster inclusivity among all kinds of people. However, it ends up affirming more hypocrisy than the conservative form ever does, because it should, as it's stated, allow people to be utterly racist, sexist, and even harbor and nurture murderous and adulterous thoughts, so long as they never act on them in a hurtful in this case being defined by the beholder, way. These kinds of beliefs, as such, are not, according to such a formulation, wrong. It's the actions that spring from them. To share an example from a different field of study, it would seem as though this is the kind of view that a radical empiricist holds. Such a view would say it does not matter which theory you use for your work, so long as you can account for the empirical data. This would mean that one could develop a fully consistent account of gravity by positing that things fall to the ground and that celestial bodies move through space because of angelic beings beating their wings to push them around, or some other such accounting. If the theory can account for all the data, such a view would have to, on the philosophical presupposition, be accepted. The magical views of primitive, for lack of a better word, peoples are often fully consistent and can make sense of all kinds of phenomena which should make their explanations equally valid, if unusual, by modern standards. It should be noted that in practice a faithful, though outside of science per se, application of Occam's razor keeps even the most committed empiricists from diverting too widely from the generally accepted consensus as to theories. It is my judgment that this kind of thinking is terribly in error. However, it is also, to a certain degree, completely consistent. What this means is that so long as this way of thinking is allowed to determine the framework of thought, the rules of discussion, no headway can be made. Appeal must be made to a more fundamental idea that lies behind such thinking that could potentially correct it. This is a methodological critique and cuts behind the particular theological conclusions and exposes problematic trends in method that cause problems in conclusions. If we start off on the wrong foot, how can we be surprised that we end up with all kinds of errors? Continuing to use our two paradigmatic examples, if we begin with the conviction that the Bible as a text is the single most important source for our thinking, and that the task of theology in the Christian life is to put the precepts contained within the Bible into clear formulation and practice, in its most consistent form, little difference in importance is made between the context of based on the context of a statement in the Bible. A strong interpretation of 2 Timothy 3:16 makes all biblical statements equally valid, equally authoritative, and equally binding on the church. And the only real debate is whether a particular conclusion is biblical or not. Both sides of a debate tend to bring forward the old hermeneutical principle of the early church and the Reformation, that Scripture is the best interpreter of Scripture, and that we should allow the clear passages guide our interpretation of the difficult passages. However, both sides tend to select different clear and difficult passages according to how well they fit their particular views. Since the Bible makes no distinction between which of its statements are clear and which are difficult, even the claim to objective truth as that which is contained in the Bible becomes hopelessly subjective, since there is no meta-scripture to appeal to for interpretation. The liberal side tends to work from the idea that love is the most important thing. However, this view tends to treat love in an abstract ideological sense, so that love is interpreted as supreme to all things. It's supreme to all interpretation of Scripture, especially those of the conservatives, whose interpretations, in all honesty, can sometimes be rather unloving. The problem with this, of course, is that it treats such an understanding of love as being interpretation-free, and thus authoritative, or at least the best of all interpretations, which cannot finally be defended except on ultimately subjective grounds. However, an objective understanding of love did not drop down out of the sky. Further, the idea that one can believe whatever they want so long as they love others or so long as they do not hurt anyone, in addition to resting on the tacit belief in an authoritative and binding definition of love and hurt that bears a remarkable similarity to the individual in question's understanding, ultimately is just as exclusive as any other views they ultimately rule as unloving or hurtful, any behavior belief as it contradicts one's own convictions. However, in spite of the fact that both views are consistent, the methodological critique I would make is the result of the question, on what grounds should we, as Christians, use those as authoritative starting points? Upon whose authority can we use the Bible as a text or a subjective definition of love as the ultimate authority? It seems that if we listen to the wisdom of the early church, we find that there is a better alternative. After all, the church has historically affirmed that it is Jesus who is of one being with the Father, who is both a human and a divine nature, and not the words contained in the Bible are fully human words and also fully divine words in the same sense that Jesus is both divine and human. And not that human love, considered an abstraction from the gospel of Jesus Christ, is the standard by which we should judge people's actions. If Jesus is the standard form which we begin and from which we self-consciously approach every topic of discussion, then it shapes the way we understand the role of Scripture, which changes from being an authoritative text to being a witness to the revelation of God primarily and normatively in Jesus Christ, and also reshapes our understanding of love, which changes from an emotion or an independently generated ideal to being the love of Christ. That is, love becomes defined by the love we see in Jesus Christ. In spite of the fact that straightening out our methodology clears up a multitude of false questions and helps to solve some real questions, it still seems to be an undesirable thing for many Christians. I believe that the reason for this is that many people are so deeply formed by a particular way of looking at things that to redefine them in the way I'm suggesting is a radical change as to seem like an abandoning of all they've known, which might even be seen as an abandoning the gospel. I think that part of the issue is that deep down, and perhaps not self-consciously, there's a desire to have something other than the gospel be the final word. And the gospel is just a special case, either of a more general biblical religion or a religion based on universal human experience. Our desire to push methodological questions aside and focus only on, do you come down on the same side of the same issue as I do, is a way to forestall, perhaps indefinitely, the real conflict that goes to the root of our faith, but it does not make that conflict go away. At the end of the day, I'm not all that concerned with where you come out on most issues. I'm far more interested in how you got from your core convictions to your positions on other issues. I'm also more interested in how your positions hang together in some kind of coherent way. It is when we understand what we think and believe on this level that we begin to really understand where we agree or disagree. It is high time that we finally abandon the false Aristotelian dichotomy between form and substance, a dichotomy unknown in the Bible, and cling to the revelation that shapes not only the content of our faith, but also shapes our way of thinking about it.